Chapter 11. There was a long silence inside the saloon after Pat Stevens made his proclamation. All the men were staring with odd fascination at the tiny tip of Rose's shoe protruding from under the bottom of the curtain. Pat set the bottle down on the bar with a loud thump and said angrily, "You don't need to be looking like that. She killed the sheriff and then took a pot shot at me when she found out that I was onto her." He walked around the end of the bar into the curtained doorway. He pulled the curtain aside to show the crumpled body of the singer laying there. Her painted face looked ghastly white in death. She didn't look young anymore. She looked like a woman who was glad she didn't have to play at being young anymore. Her right hand held a short-barreled .32 pistol. While the other men watched him with morbid interest, Pat stooped and took the pistol away from her lax fingers. He broke it and showed them two empty chambers. One for the sheriff and one for the one she wasted on me. He closed the weapon and handed it to the bartender. "Come on out back and I'll prove what I said." He stepped over Rose's body and through the rear bedroom. The men followed him in hushed silence. At the back door, Pat stopped and stood back for Ezra to go on through first. "Show us, Ezra, where those tracks were that she ran down to the alley and then came back." One of the men had picked up a lit lamp from Rose's room. He handed it to Ezra. The one-eyed man dropped to his knees and began a careful examination of the ground just outside the threshold. "Ezra's a whiz at tracking," Pat explained to the silent men. "He can outdo any Injun I ever saw." Ezra set the lamp inside and pointed to the almost imperceivable indentation in the hard ground. "That's where the sheriff stepped out. You can see it plain. And right there on top of his track is the print of Rose's heel. It's slanted and dug deep in the back, showing she was running after him." He moved forward on his knees. "And here's another one. And here's one of her tracks coming back. Still running." He pointed the evidence out to them and moved forward slowly, hunching forward and bent low as though he was actually smelling out the tracks, taking every look at all imperceivable misplaced pebble. "Right here," he said suddenly. "Right here is where she stopped and shot him. You can see where her feet were planted solid side by each. Then she whirled around on one heel and started back." He got up, mopping sweat from his face with the back of his hand. "He's sure a heck of a tracker," one of the men muttered. "That's just the way it was, all right." "If you'd told us about this right off when you come into the saloon," another man protested, "we could have grabbed Rosa and kept her from shooting at you and kept you from having to kill her." Pat shook his head. He turned back to the saloon. "You'd never have believed me. Rosa would have denied it. Only way to prove it was like I did. I scared her and gave her a chance to kill me before I said too much." "I still don't like it," the man muttered. "Seems wrong sort of shooting a woman like that." "She deserved being killed. She'd already murdered one man, in a way, to get another accused of it and maybe shot by a posse." "Yeah, but—" "You'd never have done anything to her," Pat went on angrily. "You wouldn't have lynched her like you would have that man. She'd have been turned loose to go on and pull the same game on another man." "He's right," the bartender said it abruptly. "Rosa's been all kinds of trouble. It was in her nature to stir up killing. She got drunk one night and told me about some of the things behind her. We should have ought to give this gent a vote of thanks for riding to Marfa for this hellcat. We can go on in through the other door," he went on hastily, leading them past Rose's door. "And drinks are on the house. Come on, men." Inside the saloon again, the bottle was passed around, and then two of the men hurried out to announce the news to the gathering posse, and to explain that Dusty had been exonerated, and then there wasn't any need to go off looking for him. Pat and Ezra had 2 drinks, and then Pat drew the big man away from the bar, saying, "Let's take a walk down to the laver stable and see if all the horses are still there." When they were a safe distance from the saloon, Ezra claimed, "The more people get to be thinking about the way you did tonight, the madder they're going to be getting about you shooting that gal. It's easy enough to get another sheriff in town like Marfa, but there ain't many girls as pretty as Rosa. You could have winged her, sort of, and it would have been just as good." "I didn't want to wing her. She was too pretty to go on living. She did that whole thing on deliberately," Pat went on in an angry tone. "She led Dusty on knowing it would mean shooting when the sheriff found out. If she kept on living, she would have done the same thing to some other young fellow just like Dusty. I tell you, Ezra, when a woman goes bad, she can cause all kinds of hell, even more than a dozen men." "Maybe so, but we aren't going to be very popular around here when people start thinking it over." They were nearing the livery stable. Joe Baines stood outside with a lit lantern in his hand, watching them approach. He grunted sourly, "Oh, it's you," when they were close enough to be recognized. "That's right. We heard that Dusty Morgan had gotten away after being accused of killing your precious brother-in-law. We wondered what horses he rode out on." "Didn't ride no horses from here," Baines snapped. "Think I'd let him get away?" "We were just wondering," Pat said. "What time the stage to Hermosa get away?" "Right after midnight, soon as the El Paso stage unloaded. Say," Baines went on excitedly, "do you reckon he could have caught that?" "Why?" "It stopped down the road a little piece, right after it started away from here. We saw the driver stop, and it looked like a passenger was getting on. That's strictly against the rules, though, letting a passenger on without him buying a ticket. And some of us started up to see what was what, but the driver whipped him up and rode out before we could get there." Pat grinned at him. "Maybe the driver wanted to collect a cash fare." "Yeah, that's what we thought. I bet that was him. I better tell some of the boys." "Maybe you better," agreed Pat, and he hurried away down the street. "Now what'd you do that for? Why didn't you tell him the truth, that Dusty never done it?" "He'll find out when he gets in town. Come on, we'll throw our rigs on 2 horses and grab Dusty's, and we'll put on our lead ropes. We'll be out of town before he gets back." "And we ain't paid him for no stable hire," Ezra chuckled as they headed back into the stable. "We'll leave $1 to pay for the oats." In the darkness, Pat found his bridle and went into one of the stalls Dusty had pointed out. They worked swiftly, throwing their saddles on the rested horses, and put lead ropes around the necks of their own tired mounts. They led them out the back door of the stable and mounted, swinging around at a trot to hit the Hermosa road leading west from town. They encountered no one in leaving, and the lights of Marfa soon faded into the night behind them. There was a bright mood overhead, with large stars that contributed their share to the shimmering silver sheen that lay upon the rugged landscape, softening the harsh aspect of the border country, and making it appear almost as beautiful to the men that came from Powder Valley. They rode together without speaking, holding Dusty's horses to a trot to accommodate the pace of the tired lead horses. Long ago, Ezra had taught himself to grab cat naps in the saddle when riding long trails with his energetic partner. Without ever quite falling off to sleep, he had a way of never being quite awake on a night ride like this. As for Pat Stevens, his mind was too active to let him doze off. He wondered about Dusty Morgan and his trip on the stage, whether Ben Thurston had been a passenger on that same stage as he had planned to be in Powder Valley. What would happen when those two young men reached Hermosa together in the morning? For long ago, Pat had noted a certain pattern in the most illogical and seemingly meaningless set of circumstances. Pat was not a religious man, but he had a simple belief in the existing of some unseen destiny that guided the actions of men. He had watched it happen too often before to doubt that there was a plan behind the accidents of happening tonight. A lot of seeming accidents and coincidences strung together, but in the long run, he knew they would resolve themselves into a series of unexplained events leading towards one end. He had a feeling that Katie Rollins was mixed up in the plan somehow. It wasn't just an accident that Dusty had been forced to flee from Marfa on that particular night, and by the same stage on which Ben Thurston was expected to arrive in Hermosa. It was all wrapped up somehow in a girl's great need for help and in the character of the young man who had set out from Chicago to help her. That was what had brought Pat and Ezra to Marfa this evening, in time to become embroiled in the feud between Dusty and the sheriff. There had to be a meaning to it, a meaning behind the death of Rosa. She and the sheriff had both deserved to die. There wasn't any doubt about that, but they had both deserved death for a long time. Why had this particular night been selected, if not to throw Dusty and Ben Thurston together on their way to Hermosa? It was funny, Pat mused, recalling how he had immediately thought of Katie Rollins in relations to Dusty when he had first met the kid. He was always having those crazy premonitions, which he would call hunches, and which he had long ago learned to respect. At that time, there had been nothing whatsoever to indicate that a few hours later Dusty would be riding towards a meeting with Katie. Nothing had been further from Dusty's thoughts, and Pat told himself he hadn't really managed it either. Things had just worked out that way. Of course, he had taken a hand in the game, but it wasn't according to any plan of his. He kept on not thinking about Rosa. He had seen a lot of men fall before his guns in the past. Always they had been men who deserved to die, and he never lost any sleep regretting their death. He was determined not to lose any sleep over Rosa's death. In a sense, he had deliberately planned it that way, but he was sure it was best. Dusty's name might never have been cleared if he hadn't handled it as he did, and Rosa would have gone on to commit other evils. But he couldn't forget the way the men in the saloon looked at him. He knew he was going to remember that scene for a long time. But a man had to do what he thought was right when the necessity arose. No man could ever be sure. You had to be true to yourself, to your own judgment, regardless of what others might do or say. They had jogged along for hours after leaving Marfa, and Ezra had not said a word. His big frame was hunched forward in the saddle, and his chin drooping on his chest. Pat glanced aside at him, and envied the big man his childlike ability to put aside all worrisome thoughts and questions while he dozed away in blissful peace. It was better to be that way. A man didn't gain anything by worrying and asking himself questions that no man could ever answer. The moon was beginning to pale, and the stars were slowly blinking out overhead. The breaking of day was otherwise imperceivable, but there was that added chill in the air that always seems to come before dawn in the west. Ezra straightened himself in the saddle and turned to look at Pat. He sniffed at the air and then said, "Daylight, huh? Must have dozed off for a minute." "A couple of minutes," Pat said. "Yeah, it'll be day pretty soon." Ezra yawned hugely and asked, "How far is it to Hermosa?" "From Marfa?" "Yeah. Probably about 60 miles, but we gotta meet Dusty and Baracco. Isn't that right across the river? I think it's downriver some from Hermosa. Pat was a little vague about the Big Bend geography. Dusty hightailed it across the river as soon as he hit there, Ezra suggested. He wouldn't know whether there was a posse following him or not. Pat nodded. He wouldn't be expecting us and Baracco for another day at the best. Maybe we'll stop off for a visit at the KT Ranch before we go there. Ezra roused himself to a frown and asked, What's eating on you about the KT? You asked the sheriff about it last night. And I told you, maybe the girl that's getting all of her stock rustled will be in a mind to sell some of those heifers cheap. It ain't like you to take advantage of a girl when it's in trouble, Pat. Ezra shook his head and sighed. I don't believe that at all. The darkness of night was giving way to dawn gray, showing the broken landscape of stunted vegetation which Dusty had noticed as he rode towards Hermosa. Ezra glanced about him, snorting. This is hell of cow country anyway. I wouldn't trade one ranch in Powder Valley for all this. I reckon it must get better towards the river, Pat said. The sky behind them became streaked with red, and full daylight came on swiftly. They were approaching the range of hills over which the stage had passed some hours previously. The road climbed up over rocky ridges, crawled down into shallow ravines choked with the jack pines, and up steeper ridges towards the pass that led down the opposite slope of the river valley. The sun rose behind them, and even became hot on their backs, and the air seemed thinner, more like the Colorado air they were accustomed to as they climbed higher towards the low peaks marking the tops of the range. It was a good 2 hours after sunrise when they reached the top. When they pulled their panting horses to a rest, they saw a rider following the winding road up on the other side. He was pushing his horse hard, and they both swung off and rolled cigarettes and watched him approach. He was riding an XL horse, and he pulled up with a dramatic flourish and demanded, You fellers heard about the stage? Pat shook his head. What stage? The one from Marfa, headed to Hermosa. What about it? It wrecked back yonder. The rider waved behind him. Turned over on the side of a hill and smashed up on the bottom. The driver and the passengers is both dead. Team's all tangled up and dead too. Pat threw his cigarette away and got slowly to his feet. How many passengers were there? Just one. A young feller wearing a leather jacket and Levi's. Pat let out his breath slowly. Dead, huh? Yeah, him and the driver both. It wasn't no plain runaway. They been both shot. Hold up? I reckon. He nodded importantly. Me and another rider found him just like that. He rode to Hermosa, and I thought I'd better ride to Marfa to tell the stagecoach people. Pat took off his hat. He stared down at it and then put it back in his head. He wondered why Dusty had been the only passenger. Ben Thurston should have been on that coach too. Yet many things could have prevented Ben from arriving on schedule. Must have missed connection somewhere. He asked the XL rider gruffly, Is this the right road to Barranco? Just to be saying something more than anything else. Barranco, huh? That's a pretty tough town, mister. Pat frowned and replied flatly, We ain't what you'd call tender. The rider grinned. Take the fork to the left about 5 miles ahead. That'll take you right through the KT spread and across a ford into Barranco. I better be getting on to Marfa. He spurred past them and went around the bend in a cloud of dust. Ezra cleared his throat. That's plumb tough luck, him getting killed like that. He'll never know now that he had nothing to run from. Pat shook his head and muttered. I don't see how that adds up to anything. What do you mean? What doesn't add up to what? Pat didn't reply. The pattern had been unaccountably smashed. Dusty's death didn't fit into any plan that he could see, and the pieces all seemed to fit in so neatly a few hours ago as he reviewed them. He sighed and said, I reckon we might as well ride on. He said the left fork, about 5 miles down the road. He swung into the saddle, and they started out. End of chapter 11.